Good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Mohamad Elmasry. I am working in the media program, the media studies program here at the Doha Institute, and it gives me great pleasure and honor to chair this very prestigious panel on war, warfare, and defense studies with four distinguished panelists. We're going to hear from Stathis Kalyvas, Jacek Bartosiak, Maria Zolkina, and Petro Burkovskyi, who will join us online from Ukraine. Hopefully we won't have any glitches with the connection. What we're going to do is, so we have 120 minutes. I've been asked to stay on schedule, so I will ask that our speakers limit their presentations to 20 minutes, and I'll send reminders to them as necessary. We'll then have a short amount of time for questions and comments. I'll ask that questioners limit their questions and or comments to 1 minute maximum, and then we'll give our speakers an opportunity to respond. I want to introduce our first speaker, Stathis Kalyvas. He's the Gladstone Professor of Government and Fellow of All Souls College at Oxford. Until 2018, he was the Arnold Wolfers Professor of Political Science at Yale University, where he founded and directed the program on order, conflict, and violence, and co-directed the Hellenic Studies program. His current research focuses on global trends in political violence and conflict. He has published over 50 scholarly articles in 5 languages, as well as several books and edited volumes in Greek. He's the author of The Rise of Christian Democracy in Europe, published in 1996, The Logic of Violence in Civil War, published in 2006, Modern Greece, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2015, and he's the co-editor of Order, Conflict, and Violence from 2008, and the Oxford Handbook on Terrorism from 2019. So I ask Professor Stathis to present.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Good morning again. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I was saying that the title of my presentation might be mystifying. What is substitution in political violence? What do we mean by that? And in order to explain to you what I mean by that, I'm going to paint with a very broad brush and present some of the work that I've been doing in the past couple of years as a result of my own frustration with the way we speak, with the way we think, and the way we study political violence. So I'm going to describe this project as briefly as I can. How can we reconceptualize the study of violent political conflict? And then I'll discuss 4 logics of connection, and I will focus then on what the title is about, the substitution, which is in fact the last part of the presentation, and some very brief implications. I hope to do everything within the time limit of those 20 minutes. Why would we need to rethink the way we study violent political conflict? First of all, there is tremendous fragmentation. There are people who specialize in the study of interstate violence. There are people who specialize in the study of intrastate violence. And in fact, it turns out that if you catalog the terms that are being used, you end up with a list of more than 50 names. And there is no agreement on what those terms mean. People use terms, for example, such as rebellion, in ways that mean very different things. And I do not need to remind you the conceptual debates about the definition of what terrorism, for example, is, or what genocide is. As a result, research has become extremely siloed. People who study, for example, interstate war do not necessarily follow the research on civil wars and vice versa. There is a lot of discussion about what these things mean, but not so much about how we can use concepts to understand outcomes, which is at the end of the day what we should be interested about. And the result of that is a synthesis that's very often suboptimal. For example, we don't know whether terrorism is increasing or decreasing because we don't agree on what terrorism means anyway. And important questions and avenues of research are not really exploited. So this is a summary of the issues that frustrated me. And when I started rethinking those issues, I went back to the history of the study of the modern social scientific study of political violence. And I discovered that when it started in the late 1960s, it was a much more integrated field. There was a lot of work by people who at the time were pretty famous and widely read, the people who are not read very much today, who focused very much on understanding all the versions and all the dimensions of political violence. However, their projects tended to be overambitious. They were driven by the idea that if you actually could collect data on all those forms of violence, you could actually predict their cause and therefore provide policy recommendations. And then you got a lot of those schemes in which, say, efficacy and legitimacy produced violence or non-violence, and very complicated diagrams of that sort in which basically everything is related with everything else. So these are not very useful. And as a result of that impasse, the field fragmented. But the fragmentation didn't produce the kinds of solutions that people expected. For example, in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, there's been a shift from the macro to the micro. I've been part of that shift myself. My work on civil wars has primarily been micro-level oriented. And we've reached the other extreme in which the macro aspect of political violence has been forgotten. There is now a lot of very extensive data analysis with fine-grained data that produces very interesting insights but doesn't give us much about the big picture. And the same is true, I would say, from a different direction. Deconstructing all the concepts also very often ends up becoming a self-referential type of discourse that doesn't try to focus on outcomes that need to be explained. There are a number of biases. I'm not going to dwell very much on that. I'll highlight 3 of them. In the recent kind of work, interestingly, people have emphasized domestic causes of violence as opposed to international ones. It's very interesting that the war in Ukraine has brought back the international dimension, but the truth is that because interstate war has become so rare and unusual, in spite of what has happened in the Ukraine, the emphasis on research has been on domestic features. Even the war on terror and the American interventions in the Middle East have been motivated by thinking and a language that emphasize domestic threats primarily rather than international ones. The second one is the study of political violence has always been motivated by an emphasis on the violence produced by threats to the state as opposed to the violence that the state itself produces. And finally, there has been an almost, I would say, fetishistic aspect, which is the emphasis on measuring the magnitude of violence. So the idea is that the bigger the number of casualties, the bigger the number of deaths, the more important the phenomenon is, which I think is fundamentally erroneous. The size of the violence does not necessarily tell us the political importance of the process and the phenomenon we want to study. There's been a number of attempts to resuscitate a political violence program that's more integrated, namely, I would say, the works by Charles Tilly and Randall Collins, but they haven't gone very far either. How to fix this problem? That was the question then I asked myself, given this set of pathologies, how can we produce a thinking about the field that's more integrated, better able to provide us the analytical tools we need to understand, even very basic descriptive things like trends. I start with the idea that integration is better than fragmentation. Integration doesn't mean that everything becomes uniform, but things have to be connected with each other. The second step is we have to replace separated fields with analytical categories that can operate together. There is no reason why we cannot think, for example, the ways in which interstate wars and civil wars are connected with each other, as opposed to treating them as completely and fundamentally separate phenomena. And we also need concepts that are more precise and at the same time also more flexible. And there is no contradiction between those two goals. Finally, I think perhaps the solution lies in the idea that With this kind of approach, we're not going to develop a general theory of political violence. I don't think that's desirable or feasible, but being more ambitious allows us to ask new questions as opposed to avoid asking them, as opposed to trying to provide a general theory. Finally, the two objectives in any scheme of political violence have to be maximizing the coverage, that is, what is the minimum number of categories or types of political violence that exhausts, in a sense, the nature of the coverage of the phenomenon. And the second question is, how can we minimize overlap between them? If you look, for example, at the data set, the major data set that is used by students of terrorism, the GDT, you will see that the majority of the incidents that are studied as incidents of terrorism are basically instances of rebel violence within civil wars. So there is a tremendous overlap between the data that are being used. If you look at the discussions on genocide, it's degenerated, I would say, in a competitive use and application of the term to describe politically, essentially what is politically motivated pursuits rather than analytical ones. So that creates a tremendous amount of confusion. And part of that confusion in the proliferation of terms is we bring all those terms into the same level of analysis when in fact they belong to different ones. For example, people very often think that terms like war or torture belong to the same level. And that makes any attempt to sort of describe a broader field impossible, because then all those terms belong to the same continuum. One way to clarify that, and again, I'm not going to dwell on that because I don't have much time, is to distinguish between macro, meso, and micro. At the macro level, we have composite complex phenomena like war, like terrorism, like genocide. At the meso level, we have things like ethnic conflict, gendered violence, extremism, methods like guerrilla war, actors like armies, armed actors, rebel groups, etc. And at the micro level, we have incidents, we have forms of violence, we have repertoires of violence. Those things do not belong to the same universe. They have to be distinguished if we wish to make some progress. I'm going to focus my discussion today, and my work, in fact, is focused on the macro level. So what I wish to understand is how macro-level phenomena that usually are studied in isolation from each other, how they are connected with each other. That is, when people study war, interstate war, civil war, they almost automatically or immediately understand the counterfactual to be peace. But in fact, the counterfactual of all those phenomena may be other forms of political violence. So the very simple intuition here is that violence, very simply, is the result of interaction, the outcome of interactions between actors that operate at the macro level, and that the basic actors at the macro level are either state actors or non-state actors. The state, in a sense, and this it comes as no surprise, structures that field of interactions. Bringing that intuition to a very simple kind of extension, we can see that there are three forms of interactions. There are interactions between states, there are interactions between non-state actors, and there are interactions between states on the one hand, non-states on the other hand. Developing that further, we need to specify what those interactions are. So to start from the very simple, which is also part of the discussion that is going to follow, and a lot of the discussion around the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, we have the fundamental form of interaction between states, which is basically interstate war. If we move to the second type of interaction, non-state actors against non-state actors, I would say if interstate war is probably the most well-studied and most respected field with a long tradition, the interaction between non-state actors is among the least well-studied and least well-understood. Very often people use metaphors, for example. However, there has been in the last 10 to 15 years, a field of research that has focused on interactions between non-state actors, and the term that has been used to describe that is intercommunal violence. So people can study, for example, rebel-to-rebel violence in Syria, or Hindu-Muslim riots in India, using this umbrella concept of intercommunal violence. It doesn't mean that the state is not present, but is not directly present. The main actors that engage each other tend to be actors that do not have necessarily a state sponsorship or a state, do not belong to the state organizations. Finally, the most interesting, the most complicated, and the most varied areas of interactions are those entailing interactions between states on the one hand and non-state actors on the other hand. And it turns out there are two types of interactions. There are domestic challenges against the state, everything that comes under the broad umbrella term of rebellion, and there are, in a sense, state interventions against non-state or domestic oppositions that also are varied. So let me focus on the first one, the situations of rebellion. It is possible to describe 5 fundamental forms that are very often described in the literature as civil war, insurrections or revolutions, military coups, terrorism, and then there is a form of violence which very often does not enter the purview of political violence, but has a lot of political character, which is organized crime and cartel violence. So let me explain to you the basic intuition behind those terms, which are very often contested. We can think of civil war as militarized rebellion. An army that does not belong to the state challenges the army that belongs to the state. We can think of insurrection or revolution as civilian rebellion, a mass protest that challenges the state. We can think of military coup as an elite rebellion, part of the military that factionalizes and conspires against the state. We can think of terrorism as clandestine rebellion, as the organization of very limited, very small hidden cells that operate in clandestinity. And we can think of the forms of organized crime that interact with the state as criminal rebellion, very much what is going on in Mexico for the last 20 years. I think that those 5 categories, reconceptualized in a way that avoids overlaps, allows us to clean, in a sense, and get rid of various confusions, and will allow us to measure again those phenomena in a way that's more consistent with each other by avoiding mutual overlaps. When it comes to the second form of state versus non-state violence, the one in which the state has the initiative, we can distinguish 3 fundamental types. In the literature, they're referred as state violence or state repression. And the second one is genocide, and the third one is ethnic cleansing. The way to rethink them, the intuition behind them, is to think of coercive state violence, exterminational violence, and demographic engineering. These processes, and I think that's where the usefulness of these kinds of typologies comes in, is they allow us to connect them with each other. I've identified 4 connecting logics. There is an opportunistic logic. An interstate war breaks out. Inside an interstate war, you can have terrorism. You can have civil war. You can have organized crime. The second one is instrumental. You use a form of violence to achieve another one. So, for example, it turns out the Germans in the area that is today Ukraine very often relied on intercommunal violence to achieve genocide. The third one is transformational. Violence may start as a coup and become a civil war, like in the Spanish Civil War, may start as an insurrection, like in Syria, transform into a civil war. Finally, there is what I'm going to focus my last 5 minutes on, the logic of substitution, which I think is the most interesting and methodologically the most important. Why? Because the idea here is that actors, in deciding what kind of violence to use, primarily against the state in this particular case, with the examples I'm going to use, have to decide why to prioritize a certain type of violence as opposed to another one. That is, the choice of violence is not independent of other alternatives. The counterfactual is not peace. The counterfactual is a different form of violence. This is a conscious choice that is very often the result of the internal debates of thinking, and it represents a strategic logic. It is an assessment of a cost-benefit analysis about possibilities that exist, but also ideological blinders and constraints. And it forces us to think about how you can go from one type of violence into another by, in a sense, identifying what game theorists refer to as the off-the-equilibrium path. That is, you should explain something that happened based on something, on a decision, on an outcome that was not materialized. I'll give you a few examples. There are very interesting substitution connections between interstate war and civil war. And it's very important to understand them. We can think, for example, as many proxy civil wars, internationalized civil wars, as a substitute for an interstate war that is too costly to engage. That's trivial and obvious, but there is also the opposite way. We can analyze the invasion of Russia and Ukraine as a substitution logic, going from a proxy war that perhaps no longer was working for Russia into a full-fledged interstate war, into a full-fledged invasion. So understanding why you got from one to the other is essential. You cannot analyze the decision of invasion irrespective of the benefits and costs of running a proxy war. A field in which we have a lot of very interesting dimensions to study would be the connections, and especially the substitutional logics between terrorism and civil war. Terrorism is typically a substitute for both civilian insurrections, revolutions, and civil wars, and they're driven, I believe, and that's the kinds of hypotheses that we should study more effectively, by the limitations facing the groups that decide to engage in that kind of violence. But what about more complex transitions? For example, going from terrorism to civil war and then back to terrorism. I think this is the story of ISIS. It started as a group that was clandestine, became a rebel group within a civil war, and then retreated back to clandestinity again. I'm going to also give you an example about ethnic cleansing and genocide. Ethnic cleansing is usually, and it's not thought that way, as a substitute for genocide, which is exterminational, much more costly, much more accepted. You can think of the American-Indian wars as situations in which displacement was used in lieu of extermination. And of course, we all know about the Madagascar project, which was Hitler's first step in thinking about the Holocaust, the idea of displacing Jews in Madagascar as opposed to exterminating them, and how the genocide, in a sense, came as a result of the failure of that project to materialize. We can also think of the puzzling case of Rwanda. Why did the regime in Rwanda decide to engage in extermination? Perhaps because previous attempts at expelling the minority Tutsi from Rwanda had resulted precisely in the civil war, in the invasion of Rwanda by the RPF. There are very interesting connections, fourth example, between coups and civil wars in terms of substitution. Military coups are, in effect, a very common substitute for civil war. And in that respect, I can make the provocative claim that coups are a humanitarian civil war because they do not cause tremendous violence. They do not cause tremendous humanitarian damage, even though from a political perspective, they can be extremely damaging. Also, the opposite is the case. Philip Rosler has shown how in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, civil wars are the choice of regimes as a result of coup-proofing. That is, to avoid coups which are seen as much more damaging to the regime, they, in a sense, prepare and organize the ground for the eruption of civil wars in the periphery of the country. We also have very interesting ways to think about sequential substitutions. And I think a very interesting case is the case of the organization Islamic Jihad in Egypt, which essentially began life by trying to foment a coup, and that was, in a sense, the context in which the assassination of Sadat happened. The idea that was that would produce a coup that would bring in political change in Egypt. When that failed, transnational terrorism was, in a sense, the substitute for civil war, which that organization was not able to organize in Egypt. And of course, it was a substitute also for a civilian insurrection that was also either impossible or unfeasible or undesirable in terms of the ideology of that group. And you can see how both the choices but also the nature of the group are associated with the kinds of outcomes that we get. And I'm going to conclude, and that's my last slide, with some implications. And I'm doing the same exercise with the other three forms of connections. Hopefully that will help us move into a new way to studying political violence that I think is more productive, cleaner, devoid of endless debates about definitions. We are going to move away from the idea that the end of a form of political violence leads us to peace. In fact, the reality very often is by ending a form of political violence, we move into another form, and that should help us imagine the future in different ways. But those transitions can be very different, subject to very different forces that we can only study if we focus our minds on that. And finally, I would argue that this kind of approach allows us to describe very complex phenomena. Think of the Lebanese civil war or the troubles in Northern Ireland that are composites of different ways, of different forms of political violence in ways that escape the straitjacket of having to describe them as a single political phenomenon. And I think by doing that, we open up very interesting avenues for new research, and that's the hope of this project. So thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks to Stathis for that fascinating talk. I'm sure that he's inspired many comments and questions. We'll save those for the Q&A. I want to introduce our next speaker, Jacek Bartosiak. He will speak on military transformations and the future of strategy, lessons from Ukraine. Jacek Bartosiak is the CEO and founder of Strategy and Future, a think tank based in Warsaw. He's also a senior fellow at the Potomac Foundation in Washington, D.C., director of the Wargaming and Simulations Program at the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation in Warsaw, and a senior fellow at the New Generation Warfare Center in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of the Faculty of Law and Public Administration at Warsaw University, an attorney specializing in corporate, business, and financial law, and a managing partner of a Warsaw-based law office. He's served as CEO of the Solidarity Transport Hub, the largest infrastructure project in Poland's history, and an advisor to the government for the Solidarity Transport Hub. He's the author of Pacific and Eurasia on War, 2016, Poland and the Intermarium Between the Continental and the Sea Powers from 2018, Space War and Transformation of World Geopolitics from 2021, and New Model Army for Poland, which was published just last year. So, Jacek, if you could present to us in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will not have the presentation. And 20 minutes is, it's not a lot of time for such large subjects. So I'll try to stay focused and narrow in describing what I want to convey to the distinguished audience. I will divide my presentation, my speech into two sort of separate, but of course not entirely separate subjects. The first subject is the military lessons from war in Ukraine. Another one is the future of strategy, strategic framework of what's going on, basically. And of course, war in Ukraine and the military lessons from war in Ukraine are within the context of the broader picture and the changes that we are facing and witnessing in the world, not only throughout the region that I represent. I'm based in Warsaw in Poland, which, as you know, is a neighboring country to Ukraine. So the fate of this war and the fate of Ukraine is of the highest stake for Poland for many reasons, including a principal reason that number one grand strategy principle of Poland is to keep Russia away from the European system of power, and this war is all about this. So this is the highest stake imaginable in terms of the security. But let me start with consecutive military observations from the battlefield in Ukraine that is shaping the warfare, and is also transforming the way we think in Poland in our attempt to field the modern force, maybe one of the most potent on the old continent. And we are at the beginning of this process, okay? Just there is a fear that Poland will be also in the fight within a few years if the war is not ending with the victory of Ukraine. So it's a serious thing. It's not a theoretical debate. So first of all, to surprise of many, it turns out that morale is at the center of warfare, okay? And especially so in a modern warfare, when OODA loop, observation, orientation, decision and action process, is getting faster and faster and is being helped by technology. the morale, especially in the UDA environment, modern UDA environment, is of an absolutely critical aspect. If it's missing, the cascading effect of losing, even if you have weaponry and tanks and everything, is completely heartbreaking, or even absolutely destabilizing the warfare of your country, the capabilities that you can face. So morale is at the center of it, again, and it proved so right in Ukraine. Also, morale is at the center because of the transformation towards the precision warfare. If you have the high morale, especially in defense, and you have the precision warfare capabilities, when single soldiers or the platoon or dispersed infantry, light infantry, equipped with precision warfare that can engage the mass, Napoleonic mass, like the tanks, the platoon of tanks, and it can coordinate via OODA loop, it can create miracles on the battlefield. And the morale is, again, at the center of it. Another aspect is that it is even more important in the face of reality that information is a domain of warfare. Not only information means C2s, control and command on the battlefield, that you convey messages or something, which is obvious, right? But also, parallel to the kinetic war, there is a political process, which is even more important, with all due respect to the soldiers that are being killed and wounded. The political process was always the most important. And as Thomas Schelling used to, I think it was Thomas Schelling, who was quoted in the morning, coined this phrase that war is a coercive diplomacy or something like that. Yeah, the process of coercive diplomacy by other means. So it's all about the political process. And in current times, with social media, with Twitter, with YouTube films, information domain is the most fundamental domain where you shape the perceptions of your enemy, of his soldiers, of your own forces, your own society, your friends, external friends that can help you with equipment or with political support, with money, or the other camp. And also you can shape the perception whether you are fit and modern and cool on the battlefield as opposed to backward, rusty enemy. Okay, and that is the most fundamental change. So the information domain is the domain of warfare by other means, and especially if your soldiers have no strong morale and they can see on Twitter or elsewhere that his friend is giving up somewhere in another town, there's again a cascading effect. Not to mention other greater implications, including, for example, external help. Fourth, the light infantry is back in the game. Light infantry, which if is holding a high morale, it can act in the dispersed fashion with a proper OODA loop if it believes in the purpose, if it's equipped with a precision weapon, and if it can work in the amorphic environment. So the state that is even weaker not only can win on the battlefield, but also is more immune, not entirely immune, but more immune to the pressure from the external security provider in terms of the escalation control. So the state that has a high morale of military in a dispersed fashion with an amorphic C2 can also oppose to the external demands of escalation control in case the external power wants to control the conduct of war. And it was also the case of Ukraine in the first weeks of the war, when everybody expected Kiev to fall, Zelensky to leave. He was proposed, to be moved out of Kiev, and he stood his ground. And that changed the history of Europe. So this is it. Again, it also seems that precision may prevail over mass, of course with some reservations. Then smaller forces can stop bigger forces if, again, UDA, precision, morale, all things that I have mentioned. And this will be a transformative for how militaries will be thinking. And that also kills a great strategic objective of Russia over the last 300 years, plus 300 years. Because why Russia was needed for the European balance of power? It was needed because it could field unlimited resources of manpower, and it had rigid control over how they were employed, okay? So with precision, with morale, with the transformation of warfare, it turns out that the numbers are not that important. Also that rigidity in control and command is not a favorable framework on operating on the modern battlefield. So the traditional way of war that Russia has had is acting against its strategic objectives to be a great power in Europe. And that also was shown in Ukraine. In the same vein, defense seems to defeat offense if enemies are more or less symmetrical, even if not equal. Another observation is that maneuver is always important, but it changes its nature. It is critically important because it's so difficult to concentrate mass, and also the ratio of forces and the space is rarer and rarer. I mean, the space is always bigger and the forces are smaller than in the 20th century. It is very difficult to execute maneuver in mass against an enemy that has a high morale and has information, not dominance, but at least equilibrium. And that creates hell of a problems for Russians, especially in the opening months of the war. But now it will be the same with the Ukrainians if they wanted to regain some ground. And also critically important is that in the previous wars, you know, war effort, especially maneuver, offensive maneuver, was like the ballet, okay? A sequence of coordinated actions, pre-orchestrated, pre-planned in staffs, with logistics, you know, sufficient ammo, sufficient fuel, sufficient things in a ballet. It was predictable in a way, but still, you know, it had to be orchestrated. And because of UDA loop, the precision weaponry, anti-fragility of the light infantry, that also has a smaller logistical footprint with it. And also information-based warfare. The war becomes an anti-ballet. You simply don't know how to interfere with a sequence to impose on your enemy, because you know in the war as a ballet, you had to kill the chain of events in order to prevent creating the effort by your enemy. Now it's more difficult how to prevent someone else's action, and it's all about information dominance. So if you know in advance. So tactically and operationally, it's very difficult to surprise your enemy if they are fighting on more or less equal terms in terms of information. But still, it turned out that strategically, it's doable. And not because there is shortage of information, but because there is abundance of information. So it turns out that you can intoxicate information domain by mixing false, fake, and true pieces of information of different emotional value, and shaping perceptions, wearing down also societies, wearing down the enemy by various ways how you maneuver within the information domain. And this is what Russians achieved, by the way, at the outbreak of war. At the outbreak of war. On the main Axis advance to Kiev, the Russians enjoyed 10 times superiority in numbers. And still there was a lot of talk about war, that the war is imminent. Ukrainians said they were getting ready, and still there was a strategic surprise. By intoxicating, by shaping the perceptions, okay? It is very important that we need to keep it in mind. in a way, Hitler managed to do the same during at the outbreak of Barbarossa. He intoxicated also information. Stalin was being misguided, and of course, it's worth more analysis. The last thing is attrition. Once we moved past the point of the potential quick victory by Russia, and we moved into the attrition warfare, it turned out that in the 21st century, in a major war between two states, which are not small states, there is no good method of mass mobilization. The old mass method of mobilization from the 20th and 19th centuries do not work. And there are no books, no literature, no examples how to mass mobilize. So both parties are trying to improvise. Societies have changed. In Europe, we do not work as we used to in the 20th century, by thousands of workers going to the same factory, by shifts, in a collective effort, sharing some responsibilities. It's a more dispersed. There is internet. There are different things. People changed. It's very difficult. States also operate in a different manner. So the Russians were trying, and also the Ukrainians are relying on the more or less volunteer mass mobilization. That was at the beginning, and also at some random mobilization today. And that's why today there is a challenge how to oppose the Russian mass mobilization. The Russians, in the process of their military reforms after the breakups of the Soviet Union, they destroyed their Milutinin system of mass mobilization that was invented in the aftermath of the Crimean War in the 19th century, that kept Russia alive in the First World War and the Second World War, and kept alive Soviet Union mass mobilization plans. And it was destroyed in a probably good hope that having a smaller force, more agile, would be good enough in the neighborhood, in the periphery, okay? Because the mass mobilization was too slow to react, it was very expensive, and so on and so on. And in the process, the Russians killed their mass mobilization system. Maybe if they hadn't, the war in Ukraine would have been fought in a different way, but still it was ineffective. So they had to make some decisions, and nobody knows whether the decisions were good. It also requires further analysis. To summarize, so many unknowns, mass mobilization system is not working properly. That's why, for example, I have no idea whether Russians are mobilizing properly and whether they can field the force that can really make a difference on the battlefield. And with every week of the war, every month, I think that we know less and less how it's going to work. And my maybe two last sentences, because I've already probably run out of time. Excuse me, I'm too talkative. All that is happening in Ukraine is in the shadow of the most important and most fundamental strategic challenge of our times, and also as a result of this challenge, the growing competition between the United States and China over how the world operates, meaning what globalization looks like, who controls the value chain and supply chains, meaning the principles of how nations and people cooperate and exchange goods and services. Okay? And Russia wanted to play its own game and leverage its position in Northern Eurasia by creating more maneuver space geopolitically. And this is how war started. And this is just, we in Warsaw think, is just the beginning of the chaos that will resemble the times of Napoleonic Wars, with blockades, technology, trade wars, influence wars, information wars, propaganda wars, ideological tensions, and many, many, many other things, including the potential kinetic conflict in the Western Pacific between the most powerful superpowers planet Earth has ever faced. The last sentence, there was never, at the same time, powerful China and the United States at the same time on planet Earth. Thank you.
On that provocative note, I want to thank Jacek for that interesting talk and also for staying within the time boundaries. Our next speaker is Maria Zolkina. She's going to speak on public resilience as a factor of national security in times of war, the case of Ukraine 2014 to 2022. Maria Zolkina is the David Davies Landenam Research Fellow in the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research interests focus on the fields of regional security, reintegration policies in occupied territories, and wartime diplomacy. Since 2014, she's been producing knowledge on the political component of the Russian-Ukrainian war, especially regarding the Donbass region, and has analyzed the socio-political implications of the conflict both at the national and international levels. She's been working as head of regional securities and war studies at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation, one of the most authoritative Ukrainian think tanks, and is the co-founder of the Kalyvas group. She's authored a number of policy papers and publications that have appeared in prominent Ukrainian and international mass media, and she served as an external consultant to the Ministry of Information Policy of Ukraine and to the Governmental Office for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine. Maria?
Thank you very much. I have a question, the technical one, because I don't see my presentation here, and I don't know if it was included in the right folder here. Yes, this one. Thank you. I wanted to concentrate on the case of Ukraine in terms of public resilience of Ukrainian society. First of all, because what Ukrainians have done and have been still doing on the battlefield and in terms of institutional capacity of the state and survival of Ukrainian state and society is not something which appears from nothing in 2022. It was predetermined by long-term fundamental changes which have started happening in Ukraine on the eve of 2013-2014. And during 8 years before Russia invaded Ukraine with no insignia in 2014, and before large-scale invasion, which was absolutely open in 2022, there were 8 years of fundamental changes of Ukrainian society, views, opinions, perceptions, which actually all together made Ukrainian society resilient, made them able to repel Russia's attack, and survive actually this external aggression in 2022. So I want to concentrate, first of all, on highlighting several blocks or several components of how the resilience of Ukrainian society was formed and why it was determinative for Ukrainians' position right now in the times of large-scale invasion. First of all, I will pay attention to how Ukrainian society was being consolidated and how specific division lines, which were crucial and which were present in public opinion before 2014, how they disappeared and created the basis for important further consolidation of the society. The next component is strengthening of national identity within the society, of self-perception of people of themselves as the part of political nation Ukrainians. And the third component, which is last but not the least in terms of its importance, is attitudes towards external aggression, which means how Ukrainians Ukrainians shape as of now the image of the possible end of the war, why something is acceptable or not acceptable on the contrary, and what is the attitude towards territorial concessions to explain that the current moods within Ukraine isn't something as a kind of emotional reaction. It was predetermined, it was formed much longer, much before the large-scale invasion. So starting from the consolidation of Ukrainian society and with the disappearance of significant division lines which were present and which were used by Russia in Ukraine before 2014, so that was, first of all, the foreign policy priority. So before the end of 2013, Ukrainians have predominantly choose the way to integrate with the European Union, but it was not absolute, but relative majority of Ukrainians. About 42% choose a European Union integration before 2014, while people who were in favor of Eurasian vector of integration, they constitute about 1/3 of the population at the end of 2014, around 33% of them. The developments of winter 2013-14, the revolution of dignity in Ukraine on the one hand, and the further occupation of Crimea and part of Ukrainian Donbas, infiltration of Russian regular groups in on Ukrainian territory, they changed dramatically this kind of situation. And exactly starting from spring 2014, the most important development here was that support to Eurasian vector of integration, meaning political and economic close relations with Russia or Russia-led organizations, they lost support dramatically. And incrementally, they were losing over all the period, actually. And up to now, for instance, there is about 1% of people who are in favor of having any kind of political or economic integration with Russia. Before large-scale invasion, there were 8% of them, which is not comparable to what we had before the occupation of Crimea and occupation of part of Donbas. The situation with attitude towards European integration was different. It was increasing incrementally. Not all the people who became disappointed with integration with Russia became automatically adherents of European Union integration. But anyway, large-scale invasion was the biggest trigger here, and as of now, there is completely priority number one, because almost 90% of the population, as of now, are in favor of joining the European Union. That is actually the latest changes which we fixed when it comes to 2021 and 2022, especially when it relates to the pure support towards whether Ukraine should integrate with the European Union or not. And this year of large-scale invasion made Ukrainians, brought Ukrainians like about plus 30% in terms of support to the European Union. But I'm insisting one more time, the most important changes happened in 2014 when the support, any kind of support to integration with Russia, political or economic, military, I will talk about it later, dropped up to historical minimum. This is a huge graph prepared, by the way, sorry for not saying it in the very beginning, all the graphs, all the data were prepared on the basis of public opinion polls, which are representative for nationwide scope in Ukraine. And our think tank in Ukraine, Democratic Initiatives Foundation, is very famous, first of all, for conducting independent public opinion polls and other types of public opinion research. So this data, which I refer to here, is mainly about nationwide public opinion polls. So here, this graph shows actually that Ukraine had different views before 2014. They had different views about what should be the best option to guarantee national security of Ukraine. And NATO was absolutely out of priorities. 13% of Ukrainians supported NATO membership, which changed dramatically after occupation of Crimea and occupation of part of Donbas. And exactly in May 2014, we had a huge jump, like about up to 33% of people supporting NATO, just as a reaction of having Crimea and part of Donbas occupied. But it became a tendency, and during next 8 years, we had incremental increase increase of support to NATO membership in order to guarantee national security of Ukraine. Very important that this increase did happen in all macro regions of Ukraine. Dynamics was different, but if to say, for instance, that's why I insist that when we go to inner dynamics of security-related issues or public opinion related to the war, we should go not only to nationwide level, we should compare the regions today with themselves yesterday to show what's going on within specific parts of the country. And Donbas and east of Ukraine and south of Ukraine, they also showed the increase of support towards collective model of security for Ukraine. On the contrary, at the same time, we have observed during these 8 years, we have observed dramatic loss of support of other two options which were most favorable before occupation of Crimea. Those options were either either non-bloc status of Ukraine. Ukraine was a non-bloc status before 2014, so Russia invaded country which had official legislation stating that we are non-aligned country, so just to remember. On the other hand, we have dramatic decrease of support to military union with Russia and other countries on a post-war, post-Soviet space. Of course, this tendency was present in a public opinion for 8 years, and that is why all the numbers of 80 up to 90% of support to NATO membership now are not surprising if you follow what was going in Ukraine before that. This is how it looks right now. When it comes to specific options, it's a bit different question, which we included into our poll in December 2022. The main idea here is that Ukraine is relying on, right now, Ukrainians are relying on various types of collective security models, having defense alliances with specific countries like either US, Poland, Baltic states, NATO, or actually development of Ukrainian own armed forces. And the idea that Ukraine should return to non-bloc status has no support among Ukrainians as of now. The second component which predetermined actually, which contributed to national security of Ukraine and to the formation of specific public policy in the field of security and defense is that Ukrainians started being consolidated in terms of political nation. We were measuring socio-political identity of Ukrainian society for actually the entire period of independence. But if to compare this critical moment between 2014 and 2022, so we will observe that there was a significant incremental increase in treating, in percepting themselves by Ukrainians as percepting themselves as first and foremost part of Ukrainian political nation. So there were different types of social political identity. This is a regular public question to public opinion polls, which being asked regularly from year to year. And while regional and local self-identification was decreasing, the self-identification as first and foremost, I am a citizen of Ukraine, was increasing on the contrary. And it started after occupation of Crimea and those changes, those radical changes in 2014. Another component of public resilience which contributed to ongoing national security and defense policy making is that Ukrainian society has formed already, before large-scale invasion, has already formed rather stable view on how the conflict with Russia should or should not be handled and settled. First of all, there was a clear position that territorial integrity should not be compromised. At that time, before 2022, it referred to Crimea and occupied part of Donbas. There was absolutely no readiness to sacrifice Crimea in exchange of regaining control over Donbas. There was no readiness, and it's proved by numerous public opinion polls, no readiness for any kind of restricting of Ukrainian sovereignty, making restrictions on foreign policy making, or giving a special status to Donbas in comparison to what these territories had before Russian invasion in 2014. So any political concessions which were pushed by Russia as a part of restriction on Ukrainian territory were not accepted starting from 2014, and it was very clear that the end of the conflict should be, at the same time, the main mean to end the conflict was diplomatic at that point. So there was no militarization of public opinion, and people were mainly in favor of continuing using diplomatic means, but without making concessions in terms of territorial integrity or sovereignty, for instance, foreign policy making. Thanks. And that is why, taking all that into regard, maybe it can be understandable in a little bit different way and can be perceived not just in a specific, occasional, accidental reaction of Ukrainian society towards ongoing situation and lack of readiness to sacrifice, to cede Ukrainian territories to Russia in exchange of fragile ceasefire or so-called peace. These are the results of public opinion polls which were conducted by our organization in 2022 on the territories which were controlled by Ukrainian state, even close to the front line. It showed that the image of how this war should be ended in order to make Ukrainians believe that this is victory of Ukraine. This image is rather stable. In the middle of the year and then at the end of 2022, more than half of the population, 54%, say that Ukrainian territory should be returned under the control of Ukraine, and Russian forces have to be expelled from the entire territory of Ukraine as it was before the first invasion of Russia in 2014, so meaning including, of course, entire Donbas and Crimea. And plus to those 54%, we have more than 1/5 of the population which have even more radical ideas. They think that the full victory of Ukraine is when the Russian army is destroyed and Russia doesn't constitute any threat to Ukraine, which might lead to some kind of disintegration of Russian Federation itself from inside, from Russia. So it means that as of now, there is a specific, let's say, concept of how Ukraine should go, let's say, within diplomacy and military track in order to win in this victory. And there is a specific backup and support to the entire occupation of Ukrainian territory. What changed in comparison to the first phase of the war, 2014-2022, and what is different now? While before, more than 50% of Ukrainians regularly relied on diplomatic means, as of now, there is no trust in any kind of making political deals with Russia. 60% of Ukrainians believe that peace negotiations with Russia are impossible because Russia will not keep the agreements anyway, having in mind what happened during 2020, during previous 8 years. And at the most recent public opinion polls, we put one of provocative questions, let's say, asking what should Ukrainian political and military leadership do in case that Western support will be significantly decreased or even stopped. And we have received the results that about 60% when it comes to overall Ukrainian result, 60% of the people said that Ukraine should continue fighting unless we are fully out of any means to that. So should continue the war defending its territory. So the peace at any price didn't find support when it comes to the situation in December 2022. And all these components of which predetermined actually the perception of how the diplomatic and military strategies of Ukraine should look like in terms of defense and national security public policy. So what's the impact actually of all these components on the real public policy making? So first of all, there is a high public support to the idea that Ukraine should repel Russia's attacks, and we have witnessed several important trends in 2022 when there was huge numbers of volunteer mobilization without forceful conscription of Ukrainian people to the army. There was unprecedented fundraising of Ukrainian people themselves. There was volunteering, horizontal network of volunteers supporting the army all around the country, support to Ukrainian RDPs, and other symbols or other trends which signified the consolidation in the times of the war. Second impact or second signal of impact was that Ukrainians are fully in support of both diplomatic and military strategy which is being implemented by both political and military leadership of the country, support to the strategy to deoccupy the entire Ukrainian territory. It means next important part of its impact. It means that the defense-related decisions, at least as of now, are being legitimized, and on the contrary, you shouldn't expect we shouldn't expect that any kind of territorial concessions on the side of Ukraine imposed in terms of so-called political deal with Russia will be legitimized within Ukrainian society. Then I'm pretty sure I would speak about I will speak about some kind of domestic destabilization, delegitimization of authorities, and other possible consequences when it comes to when you impose something which is completely rejected for the society, not just now, but for many years so far. And the last but not least is that this kind of public resilience formed within the society, within the country, contributed and will still contribute to political decisiveness of those who help Ukraine. Even purely military staff are fully aware that without the decisiveness of Ukrainians to fight at the beginning of large-scale invasion, no support would come to Ukraine, actually. So with this, I think I am perfectly well with my timing, and I will be happy to answer some other questions afterwards.
Many thanks to Maria. Really interesting data there with some potentially very serious implications. I'm sure that she'll generate some questions and comments. Our last speaker is Petro Burkovskyi. I just want to make sure that our technology is okay. He's joining us online from Ukraine, and he's there. Petro, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Do you hear me well?
Yep, we can hear you. Great. So I'm going to give you 20 minutes. I ask that if you can just keep a little clock next to you so that you don't go over time. We'll really appreciate that. I'm going to introduce you briefly, and then you'll have 20 minutes. So Petro Burkovskyi is the executive director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. He received a master's degree in political science from the Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and he's an alumnus of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. He completed a defense management course at the UK Defense Academy of Cranfield University. Between 2006 and 2020, he worked in the National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine. His areas of expertise include history, sociology, and international and security studies. Thanks, Petro. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a kind introduction, and I want to thank for the invitation to this conference. I really want to thank to Dr. Amar Ashur, who is doing incredibly splendid job to promote security studies and to give a voice from Ukraine. I want to greet all of the guests and speakers from Kiev. I'm right now in Kiev. Salam alaikum. Also, I'm happy to see in the hall the ambassador of Ukraine, Your Excellency. I hope you remember our cordial conversation in the backstages of the Al Jazeera in the presence of the first Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Emine Japar. From here, then, let me tell you a little bit about our case study that we conducted last year. So my topic is about a very specific, distinctive but integral part of the Ukrainian armed forces, which are Ukrainian Volunteer Nationalist Unit. Before I start, I will just give you a review that this study was based on the research we conducted beginning from July up till the September last year, when they interviewed the leaders of the key volunteer units, including people who were in the front line. And also I want to mention my respected co-author, also the analyst of our foundation, Taras Tarasuk. So when I heard the first presentations in this panel, I want to thank to Jacek Bartosiak, because his observations coincide with what we found out in this very specific, very distinctive case study. Mr. Bartosiak spoke about several components, which are morale, information, and the role of light infantry. And it's extraordinary to know that these are the same elements that we found out when we studied the activities and the battlefield actions and the organization of the Ukrainian voluntary nationalist units. I need to give you in 5 minutes a little historical background about this phenomenon. Before 2014, before the Revolution of Dignity, the Ukrainian nationalist parties were not influential in Ukraine and were not very visible. But during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, they appeared to be the most capable civilian forces which counteracted against attempts of the riot police and the oppressive regime of Yanukovych to crack down on the Maidan protests. And when Russia started its invasion in 2014, these people from the nationalist parties, from the nationalist movements, they were among the first who formed the first volunteer military units which engaged with Russian forces, specifically Russian special forces in Donbass, and engaged with them quite successfully. So Russians did not expect at that time that they will be fought with the same kind of hybrid techniques and hybrid tactics. Before I'll start and review what has happened after February 24, I just need to remind a very subtle truth, that if something is absent, you cannot rely on it. So when the whole world was astonished and surprised and excited by the fact how Ukrainian forces resisted to the Russian forces, and Ukraine was not overrun in a few hours or a few days in the beginning of invasion, then we need to know that something was already present on the ground. And the volunteer nationalist units, they really played a very important role in repelling Russian attacks in the first hours and in the first days of the Russian invasion. But that was the picture that we observed, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And on the surface, you will find that in the last 6 years, before this second full-scale invasion of Russian forces, there was a process that was ongoing inside Ukraine. These first volunteer military units, they obtained their first battlefield experience in 2014-2015. And what they have done, they have organized the network structures which allow them to exchange and enhance their experience and to train people to be prepared for the next round of the Russian invasion. So there was a clear foresight. There was a clear foresight among these troops, among these volunteer units, and among the veterans who bought within their ranks that there will be a next stage, a full-scale invasion, and that the people should be more prepared, and the more people should be enrolled and taught how to behave and what to do in this kind of crisis. So what were the key elements of this networking? First, of course, that was training and permanent, constant training. It included several components. First, of course, it was training on basic combat skills, tactical medicine, and a field training which simulated the field conditions during the real battle. So they trained in summer, they trained in winter, they trained in a mixed season, meaning spring or autumn. So they were training all year around in a different environment, irregular terrain, in the forests, in the fields, in the urban areas. So they do really tried to learn from the Western techniques and the Western military experience taught in NATO, and they did it voluntarily. They financed it. The second component is that the members of these volunteer units between 2016 and 2022, they were encouraged to engage in an active sport lifestyle. So they conducted regular competitions on the different sports. They spent their free time very often on camping and tourism, just getting used to the possible hard conditions of living in the field and outside of the cities. And the third very important component, and here I just also make a reference to what Mr. Bartosiak said, is that the ideological training. And by saying this, it was not an indoctrination of a certain ideology, but the explanation to the people on the examples of historical lesson, why Russia is a threat to Ukraine and how it can threaten Ukraine, what tactics and strategies Russia used in the past, and how this should be tackled. They also learned from the lessons of failures, the past failures. Next, and they also they were taught how propaganda works and how it should be resisted and how it should be recognized, identified, and how it should be resisted. Second, and a very important element of the high readiness which the nationalist volunteer units demonstrated in the first hours and first days of the invasion was the preemptive or preventive mobilization. So actually, beginning from December, and I give here the very illustrative example of the Azov movement. In the early of December, the Azov movement organized and open courses for the tactical medicine, for the basic combat skills, for the use of the firearms, and it was opened for the civilian population. And until February 2022, around 2,000 people across 12 regions of Ukraine went through these courses, and that was only the Azov movement. A part of Azov, there were also Svoboda courses and courses presented by the Duk Right sector. So it means that dozens of thousands of people before the invasion were already started training, and that helped a lot. Because these people joined either volunteer military units or the territorial defense forces, which repelled the first attacks of Russians near Kiev and near Kharkiv. Another important element, and the third element, is that these nationalist volunteer units were best prepared for conducting missions assigned for the light infantry. So they were highly mobilized. They were highly motivated. For the last 6 years before the full-scale invasion, they were among the first who adopted techniques of using civilian drones for reconnaissance and for making strikes. And from the very first days of invasion and throughout all of the 12 months of the war, they only sophisticated and enhanced their knowledge and their tactics as light infantry units and special forces operation units. So that helped them. Just a very short example that played a very important role when the Azov organized an effective defense in the complete encirclement in Mariupol from the late February until the beginning of May. These light infantry units of these light infantry volunteer nationalist units, they played an important role stopping Russian mechanized advances at the critical points like Kharkiv in March and April last year, at Izum-Barvinkovo direction in April, May, and June last year, in defense of Rubizhne-Severodonetsk conjunction in summer, and in defense of city of Bakhmut, which lasts since May last year and until now. And moreover, as a reconnaissance teams, these volunteer units played a very important role in a successful implementation of the offensives in the Kherson region and liberation of Kherson and liberation of the Kharkiv region in September, November last year. And another important aspect that I would try to cover is that they also played and they were indispensable in conducting sting special operations behind the enemy lines near Crimea, in a steppe Kherson, when they delivered information about Russian cargoes with equipment and munition, and these cargoes were hit by the HIMARS. And also there are evidence, and there are strong evidence that the members of the nationalist volunteer units made a very successful missions inside mainland Russia, not only near the border, but 100 kilometers behind the Russian border inside the Russian regions. By this, I maybe would stop and would be glad to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Petro. I can already see people have their hands up. So we have about 40 minutes for questions and answers, okay? So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to take as many questions as we can for about 15 minutes. I ask that the questioners please tell us your name, but please avoid long introductions and commentaries, and please limit yourself to 1 minute maximum for your comment and or question. I'm going to ask that our speakers please write down the questions as they're sort of coming in, if they're addressed to you. Also, importantly, the questioners should tell us to whom they're addressing their question. Tell us which one of our distinguished speakers you're addressing. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I see our first hand was up right here. Tfaddal. Yeah, can we get the mic down here, please? Bear with us as we get our microphone situation squared away, as we wait in anticipation, and I try to kill time. What's that? He's got it right here.
Yeah, this one's working. Thank you very much. Since we were limited to 1 minute, I have 4 questions in less than a minute. The first one, the first 3 to Stathis. And you know, when you talk about being precise and flexible, to me is oxymoron. So would you please elaborate a little bit on that? Because, you know, it was not really clear to me when you come up with the typologies. And the second one is that if you can also touch on the privatization of violence and where it fits in your framework. And a third one is the, I mean, when you talked about terrorism as probably the weapon of the weak, and what about state terrorism? Because in the Middle East, we witness state terrorism, if you can fit this in your also framework. And the last question is for Maria. I mean, he talked about the public opinion and the shift in the public opinion, but as we know, in October, Putin launched a campaign against the infrastructure, aiming to demoralize the public and also probably make a shift or bring about a change in their position. Did you take this into account? And if yes, I mean, would you please elaborate on that? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Question right here, Dr. Mohamad. Right down here in the front, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohamad Saloom. I'm from the Doha Institute. My question is to Professor Kalyvas. You mentioned quite a few interesting points regarding interstate violence. I want to ask you about the substitution logic when it comes to the Iranian matrix or strategy in supporting certain civil wars in Iraq, in Lebanon, Syria, and also supporting other non-state actors in Palestine, Yemen, versus the Saudi reaction. Saudis, it has been framed that Saudis see themselves as the target of Iranian involvement in these hotspots. And the question is, does the choice of violence of one side in this very particular case determines or shapes the reaction of the other, and is it calculated? Thank you.
We have another question right here, yep.
My name is Andrei Kuzmenko. I'm ambassador of Ukraine. I'm extremely happy to be here. I have the question for a distinguished professor from Warsaw. Ale najpierw chciałbym, dziękuję bardzo teraz pani Jacek. Bardzo cieszę się, że profesor z Warszawy jest tutaj i dziękuję bardzo Polsce za wszystko dla Ukrainy. I have thanked to distinguished professor from Polish in his language and for Poland for everything this country is doing for Ukraine. And I have the question for you. You have mentioned that the information is the domain of this warfare. In fact, the first steps of the Russian aggression, full-scale aggression, in February of the last year failed due to the misperception of the information, and the Russians fall down the victims by their own propaganda of the same nation, of the friendly Ukrainians under the oppression of the Ukrainian nationalists, fascists, and so on. However, till now, the Russians still using these propaganda terms. They do not refer to the armed forces of Ukraine as the armed forces of Ukraine. They are talking about the Ukrainian nationalists. They are talking about the Polish battalions, Americans mercenaries, and so on. So this is a fundamental mistake, it seems to me. And don't you think that if the fundamental mistake is defining in such an important field as information domain of the warfare, it means that the Russian has failed already.
Thank you. Right behind. I will come to this side of the room, I promise. But let's just try to get a couple more here and then we'll move on. Yep. Go ahead.
Okay, I would like to thank the speakers. My name is Amna Lansari. I'm a critical security student here in Doha Institute. My questions are first for Mr. Kalyvas. I apologize if I pronounced it incorrectly. You talked about the proxy war. I want to ask about the Vietnamese war. Does the Vietnamese war fall in this category, or does it consider a state versus state, considering that the United States of America played a really huge role in this war before its withdrawal and let it look like it's a civil war between Vietnamese? Also, I will be happy if you explain a little bit about the military financial assistance in the proxy war, for the Vietnamese war, if it does fall in this category. Also, you did mention about the Ukrainian war as a proxy, Ukrainian-Russian war as a proxy war going to full-fledged interstate war invasion. I want to ask about what is the role of the NATO military in protecting the European region, considering that there was a bit of support for Ukrainian, not yet no real action against Russia. Is there a concern of escalation this proxy war to a war if NATO get into the frame, or is there another explanation?
Thank you.
Another one question.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to limit. I'm going to ask everybody to please maximum 2 questions because we're never going to be able to get to all these, okay? We have a question right here, Dr. Laurent, right here.
Thank you very much. So I will ask 2 questions. First, to the third speaker. Sorry, I can't read the names from here. I wanted to say thank you very much. You made a very compelling argument. You measure the opinion changes about following military or various forms of Russian interventions, which were military dominated. But I have a question as to the role of energy supplies being cut, reduced, at various times since 2006, how these interventions, 2006, 9, 2014, and so on, how have they played a role in changing the opinion towards, in Ukraine towards Russia? Or has it not played any role? So I'd be happy to hear about that as well. And to the first speaker, in his call for new forms of studies which can be more integrated, where do you see precisely the role of the weaponization of energy, for instance, in this kind of energy studies, because it does play a role locally, internationally, and so on, and water studies as well? Thank you.
It's clear. Thank you. One last question on this side, and then we'll go to this side of the room. Thank you. I think the microphone is off.
Better? Yes.
There we go.
Tony Lawrence from the International Centre for Defence and Securities in Estonia. So the question is inspired by something that Jacek said in his presentation, but I'd be also interested in what Petro has to say about it. So one of the outcomes of the war in NATO Europe, and in particularly Northern Europe, has been a return to policies of conscription, or the placing of a greater emphasis on conscription to build large reserve armies in the case of conflict. And given, Jacek, what you were saying about the possible favouring of precision over mass, and also what you were saying about the difficulties of mobilisation, would you say that this is a wise policy move on behalf of NATO Europe states? Thank you.
Thank you for the short question. Let's go over to this side of the room. We have a question here in the middle.
Thank you for all speakers. Abdul Karim, Health Systems Specialist, King's College, London. So the first question is for Maria and Petro. So you talked about community resilience in Ukraine, which was one of the factors to be able to resist the Russian invasion. I understand your work that focused on understanding the opinions and the perception of communities, but have you done anything on understanding the factors that contributed to this resilience? For example, whether the Ukrainian governments worked on availability of services or quality of services or maybe economy situation or governance and leadership that contributed to shaping the relationships within the community so the community is more resilient. And I think this ties to the question from one of the speakers here about the role of energy, for example. So, and also the negative factors of resilience, weakening the resilience that the Russians might have implemented, because we've seen this in Syria. So they were trying to weaken the resilience of the communities, so they are more prone to surrender.
Thank you. Right in front of you. Yep.
My name is Mariam from the Arab Center. My question is to Maria. What's the difference between national resistance in time of war and national resilience? And what's the definition of national resilience that you've used in your research, which leads me to other questions about post-war national resilience in Ukraine and, let's say, like society rehabilitation. Will there be any effects to other national insecurities on the national resilience, like food security, energy security? And what about the refugees and displaced as a result from the war? How do they fit in your examination of national resilience? And what about internal conflicts in Ukraine before the war and post-war? Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Omar, right here.
Thank you for a really, really fascinating panel. I really enjoyed it. 3 quick questions after the chair is okay with, hope the chair is okay with that. First 2 to Stathis. Thank you very much, really great presentation. Just the substitution of violence, is it the same or different from what the literature sometimes calls strategic shifts, shifts in ways of warfare? So an organization, you mentioned ISIS, so one of its cases, it's by conscience decided to dismantle all of its guerrilla units, all of its sniper units, and focus only on IEDs, how to plant IEDs, how to manufacture IEDs, and turn the campaign from a guerrilla campaign or an insurgency into an urban terror campaign. This is in 2008. And that helped the organization to survive and then sometimes win. Same happens on a state level, by the way. The state sometimes chooses to focus on one branch of the armed forces or a way of warfare and put all of its resources in that direction. So that's one. The other one is what happens when a coup, you mentioned the Spanish coup and it led to a civil war, but what happens if the coup, something like the Soviet coup attempt in 1991 that led to all kind of violence, interstate, intrastate, insurgency, terrorism, you name it, from Karabakh to Chechnya to Ukraine now. So all these wars of the Soviet succession, if you wish, were triggered by a failed coup, if you can put it there. So one violence, it's exactly it fits in the framework, one violence leading to another type of violence. But if you can comment on that in terms of the mega events. And then actually this is to Jacek, but also Maria and Petro can weigh in. I may disagree a bit. I think the Russian mobilization, it's not a partial mobilization, it's a full mobilization, but I think it worked. It worked, why? Because, and this is the Ukrainians took it very seriously while we were making fun of it and saying, you know, the unequipped, untrained, and so on. You will find one of the main evidence of that. You will find some of the units, like the 11th Corps in Kaliningrad, the 1st Tank Squad Army. Those were destroyed in the battles of Sumy, Cherniv, Kharkiv. They were really shells. And now these units are back in action. And the advance of Ukraine in Kharkiv stopped. The mobilization that happened in the Donbass is leading to some success in Solidar and in Bakhmut and other areas. So overall, that manpower, even without proper training, proper equipping, is kind of working because they are dying but advancing. One last thing, so they mobilized around 300,000, that's the estimate. Where is the estimate as well as there's 150,000 in the field in Belarus. The other 150,000, do we have any idea what they're doing with them in terms of training and equipping and so on? Thank you.
I gave the chair of the conference a little bit of extra time. We have a question online. Gordon Is Gordon available? Can you hear me, Gordon?
Yes, I can. I hope that you hear me and that you can
Yes.
see me.
Can you ask a quick question? You have 1 minute. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry to be here, but it was very interesting. I would like to ask and challenge Jacek for one question that one statement that he said, it's about the morale. I know it's from our experience that morale is just a consequence of the set of the strategic activities. For example, the Croatia, when we run the conflict and the war, we run it as a chess player in 4 different chessboards concerning kinetic, non-kinetic, international, and internal cohesion. So why we have a very high morale by the military and population, it's a fact that we rise, that we know why we are fighting, we know what we are trying to achieve, and when we won't like to do it. So I think that it's not proper to just to say that morale or information domain is most important thing. This is one of the things, one of the domains that needs to be integrated in one cohesion and in one coherent unit of the activities that we see in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question right here in the back. Can we get the microphone there in the back row? And I ask that our speakers get ready. You'll all have 4 to 5 minutes to respond to as many questions as you can.
Thank you very much. Jeroen Gunning, King's College, Middle East Politics Professor. 2 questions for Stathis. Really like the idea of the typology, sort of going beyond peace, war, dichotomy, and all that kind of stuff. One smaller question. The terrorism thing, like the earlier question, I'm wondering whether there's too much of an echo there of the kind of the earlier kind of terrorism studies, which is kind of looking at small groups that are doing sort of bits of kind of small terroristic violence, which doesn't, I mean, as you know, terrorism is being carried out by a lot of different groups, including in civil wars, in interstate wars, by state actors as part of repression. So maybe that particular kind of definition needs to be slightly changed to kind of to take account of that, because they're very different dynamics, right? If you have a small clandestine group like the Red Brigades in Italy, that's very different from, say, Hamas in the Palestinian-Israeli context. So I just wondered what your thoughts were. The second, slightly more kind of fundamental, is are you not sort of replicating some of the problems that, for example, within social movement theory, the sort of the contentious politics sort of wing of that was saying, if you just focus on repertoires of contention, you miss the kind of the political social context that explain why certain choices are being made. So you're focusing on the tactics, the repertoire, and the actors, whether they're state or non-state, but not necessarily on the political and social context that would motivate them to do certain things or other things. And so how do you make sure that that kind of political context is brought back into that game, rather than sort of just looking at sort of tactics and the actors? And that's partly also because violence is often part of a larger repertoire, where, as you know, you can move into violence and out of violence. And by just looking at violence, you're kind of cutting off the other bit, or at least there's a risk of doing that. So your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions. I'm going to start with Petro. Petro, you have a couple of minutes here if you'd like to address some of the questions and comments.
Thank you really for this opportunity. So the question was about the factors that contribute to resilience. First, the one, I think there are several were in play here in Ukraine. First, Russians were expecting that the society will be shocked and divided. And the sociological opinion polls, they show that there are some issues about the internal divisions in Ukraine, that on the eve of the invasion, and if you remember, just several months before the invasion, Ukraine experienced the high wave of the COVID-19 Delta wave, the most deadliest one, and actually which caused the collapse of the healthcare system in Ukraine. And Russians do really observe that this caused a tremendous popular backlash against the government. In the end of December 2021, as I said, was just 2 months before the invasion, the level of trust toward the president it decreased to the lowest points of the Zelensky presidency. The distrust in government in Zelensky was more than trust by 20 percentage points. So they thought that people are divided, that people are alienated against the government. And as you know, it's the truth that has been known for the last 2,500 years, described by Sun Tzu. So if you want to win the war, you should divide the ruler from his people. And that was the expectations, the Russian expectations, the division between the government and the people. However, it appeared that while people were dissatisfied with the governments on the domestic issues, the society was highly mobilized against the foreign invasion. And we also measured it before the war, and just 10 days before the war, we conducted a poll in February 2022. And we asked people, what would you do if Russia invades? And up to 22% of the people, they said, the respondents, it was a nationwide poll representative. And they said that they are going to join either regular armed forces or the volunteer units. As actually 14% of the people, they were saying that they are going to join volunteer units. And therefore, that is the reason why I explained this case of the nationalist unit. And another 25%, they said that they are going to help the army in a non-lethal way, like providing food, money, donations, blood as a donors, etc., etc. So actually, people were united behind the state, not behind the specific president, but also behind the state. In the first days of invasion, it turned out that Zelensky is a different kind of leader, and that was a second crucial factor of resilience, that the political leadership was much more capable and that it can be trusted a lot, that the president stayed in the country, stayed in the besieged Kiev, and he behaved in the same way as the common people behaved, that he didn't run away, he stayed and he decided to fight, in the same way how millions of people decided to do that. And second point, of course, of the resilience is your readiness to tolerate the pain. And if you have the choice between smaller or bigger pain, of course, you would choose a smaller pain. I think that was the case when France surrendered in June 1940. When the government collapsed, the rest of the government, the rest of the army, they decided to choose the least pain, because Germans did not threaten French with extermination. However, in case of Russian invasion to Ukraine, the choice was between a great pain and a death. And of course, in this situation, in this existential situation, the choice is evident. You will choose the great pain, a lot of casualties, but not the extermination.
Thank you, Petro.
So that was the third factor of the public resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Petro. Much appreciated. Jacek, you're next. You have 5 minutes.
Sure, thanks. First, thank you, Honorable Ambassador, for warm words, especially in my own language. Much appreciated. Of course, I could spend much more time talking about how I see the things and cooperation between Poland and Ukraine, which seems inevitable in the years to come, also including the military. That's my personal opinion, not my government yet. I hope this will change. But specifically to your question, is that if you run the information warfare, you have many recipients of messaging. It's society, it's people, your military, Russian military also, the Chinese, the Americans, American society, the global opinion, CNN, Al Jazeera. So it's always very difficult to calibrate your messaging so that it could accommodate and please everybody. And Russians have made serious mistakes. I think that one of the most major mistakes they made is just the information campaign downgraded the level of their military preparedness for what they are about to face. And that was a major factor. So they underestimated that the troops should be ready for a major fight, intense fight. And they didn't know that. So that was a major thing. You know, to cut long story short, I think that they lost, so far they lost, generally they lost the information warfare. The Ukrainians have presented themselves marvelously, given what had been anticipated for sure prior to the war. But there was one battle still to be won by Ukraine, Ambassador. And I think it's about the perception in the Western strategic circles, including the American circles, that Russia is not a great power. It has lost this status because this mental map that resides within the Western strategic culture, that whatever happens, those guys are always a great power, keeps them afloat in the political process that is always next to the military conduct. And whatever happens, they will be at the negotiating table. And a process that is closely connected to it is this feeling that this is a nuclear great power, and Russia, by using information domain, is shaping the perception of the Western strategic circles that that Ukraine cannot be helped substantially now. It is trickled, you know, by two tanks, 3 howitzers, and so on, in order to control escalation, because, you know, you're facing the nuclear power. This is the battle that you're losing, and Russia effectively deters, isolates the battlefield by information domain. Once you overcome this hurdle, there is a great chance that Ukraine is going to win and change the history of Europe. But this is one of the most important battles still to be won.
You have about a minute left if you want to try to address a couple of the other questions.
Mass mobilization, I just think there are 2 left for me. Mass mobilization. Why is, it's a very difficult question. I'm still grappling with, struggling with how to answer. I don't know. And also the ways your conscription may be different. There are no general rules in my opinion, 21st century, and we need to write books about it, think about how to do it. For sure, the Russians, and this is also the response to Omar, they destroyed their mass mobilization system. What they are doing now is just random filling in the ranks, just connecting empty pieces, and it worked in terms of filling in the ranks, because their front was disappearing because of the lack of mass at all. But it's not a working system in terms, you know, as it was during the Soviet Union and during the First and the Second World War, which was quite a machine. It's not the case. So I don't know how, I don't know how to assess it at the moment. It's an honest answer. Basically, these are my...
Many thanks. Thank you very much. Maria, you also have 5 minutes.
Okay. First of all, I will add just a comment because Petro has already perfectly well answered the question on resilience. I will add that in the period between 2014 and 2022, there were simultaneous 2 processes within Ukraine. On the one hand, Ukraine was already in a war with Russia and suffered especially in terms of frontline areas in Donbas or in Kherson region, which administratively bordered with occupied Crimea, suffered from the consequences of ongoing aggression and hostilities in Donbas. But on the other hand, it was probably the most fruitful period in terms of domestic political reforms. And I would suggest that those reforms contributed in terms of long-term perception conception of how resilience and resistance are being built. For instance, one of the reforms which in my opinion was of great importance was decentralization, which meant not only fiscal and financial decentralization, giving more financial opportunities to local communities, but changing administrative system within the country generally, making local communities elected by local populations the very first actually ruling body on the ground, rather than administrative bodies which hire or where heads of administrations are being appointed from above. And several years, namely 5 years, in between the beginning of decentralization and the large-scale invasion, they contributed a lot to creation of local networks, of local leaders, of people being able to coordinate their activity, and actually there were local authorities who were responsible for major part of the first decisions taken into support of territorial defense forces at the beginning of large-scale invasion, and who were responsible for organization of local logistics. So if Ukraine was civilly centralized country, I doubt we would have the same horizontal resistance around the country. Regarding the attacks on critical infrastructure, we have, from logic of this war, we have no doubts that Russia counted actually on decreasing the morale and making Ukraine unlivable space during winter times. But it wasn't the case, fortunately, for Ukrainians' resistance. Namely, it was included in our public opinion polls at the end of December, which showed that the belief in Ukraine's victory over Russia even increased since August. So actually it was the logic of public opinion in Ukraine, again started from 2014. Every time during this conflict, Russia pushed harder militarily. The reaction was not peace at any price or surrender ideas. There were the increase of resistance. So actually that's the case. And I see that lady who asked about resilience and resistance and post-war resilience. She left, but I will anyway answer, because in my approach, I choose rather resilience than resistance in order to not just concentrate on occasional structural responses to ongoing attacks or just withstanding some turbulences, but combining this kind of withstanding the turbulences on the one hand and simultaneous recovery, because I think this is the best, Ukraine is the best showcase from this point of view, both was before large-scale invasion and of course after, taking into account how everything is rebuilt, reconstructed, not technically, I'm speaking not about infrastructure now, but in terms of processes, decision-making, and replacing, fulfilling, the functions which are being harmed by the after effects of ongoing war. So, to my opinion, the resilience as something, as a concept looking into recovery, maybe it's more applicable, and it will be a continuation between how Ukraine is being resilient and resistant now, and how Ukraine will be due to this, let's say, recovery plus repelling of Russian attack, how Ukraine will be resilient after the end of active fighting phase. Thank you.
Thank you. So it just so happens that we have about 7 minutes left, and a slightly larger share of the questions came in for Stathis, so I'm going to give you 7 minutes to respond.
Thank you very much for the vigorous chairing. I really appreciate that. I'm going to try to group questions together. I think the key issue in what I'm trying to do is precisely the two terms, precision and flexibility. Precision because all these categories are macro phenomena that can be observed in a sort of autonomous way, historically and geographically, but also they can empirically overlap. So we're talking about, you can observe a civil war as an independent phenomenon, but you can also observe a civil war in the context of a larger interstate war. And so the question is to combine analytically separate definitions. So a civil war can be defined as armed combat within the boundaries of an existing polity, versus interstate war in which two states fight within each other. So you can have elements of an interstate war within a civil war. To give you just two examples that were cited here, there was a clash between Americans and Russians in Syria. That you can describe as an interstate clash within what is effectively a civil war. Almost every single civil war in history has had a very pronounced element of external intervention. There are always foreigners involved in civil wars. It's very unusual. In fact, I cannot think of a single civil war in which there hasn't been external involvement. But some civil wars have much more external involvement. When you have, for example, beyond financial assistance, logistical assistance, training, you have the army of a state fighting in another civil war. So the Vietnam War is an example of that. But there were elements of an interstate war within the Vietnam War when, for example, the Americans were bombing Hanoi. And the logics of connection that I described have different logics. I described substitution, but there are different ones. There's transformation. So the Vietnam War in its final stage becomes an interstate war when North Vietnam invades South Vietnam. And this is the end of the conflict. So I think that vocabulary is difficult initially to accept because we tend to think of these things are completely incommensurable. But in fact, I think accepting analytical distinction but empirical overlap forces us to grapple with that. And I'll use the example of Gaza, the Gaza Strip and Israel-Palestine. From the moment the Israelis withdraw from Gaza, I think a very large proportion of military engagements between Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas, and Israel take on an interstate dimension, even though Gaza is not a recognized state. At the same time, the activities of Palestinian, say Hamas militant within Israel proper, in which they target civilians, those can be characterized as terrorism. So we don't have to call everything that happens in Gaza between Hamas and Israel a terrorist phenomenon. We can separate into different types of phenomena and try to understand precisely this is where context matters. For example, why would you observe in certain flares-ups of violence different proportions, say of certain different proportions of terrorism vis-a-vis the more interstate type of engagement, etc. Those become questions to investigate as opposed to questions that are closed off because we have decided to designate the phenomenon in a certain way. I think this is what I'm trying to push. So in a sense, to open up the research agenda as opposed to close it down. Questions about privatization of violence, you can have that, it's a repertoire, you can have that in various, under various types of violence. You can have mercenaries in an interstate war, you can have mercenaries in a civil war. The ISIS example you gave is an example of substitution, so it's strategic. At the same time, I wouldn't want to call the effects of the Soviet coup, the failed Soviet coup in 1991, substitution or anything else, because there are many other steps in between them. And therefore, that would, in a sense, completely push us in a very different direction. So the idea here is to understand connections that are directly linked. And of course, you have to take non-conflict into account, but this is generally seriously thought about. So when people study mass protests, they think about peace as an alternative. When people think about interstate war, they think as peace as an alternative. What I think we have failed to think systematically is of other forms of political violence as alternatives. That's why I've insisted on that. In these kinds of proxy interventions in other civil wars, you can have either unintended effects when, for example, another state intervenes as a response to the initial intervention, or you can have provocation. That is, you intervene precisely because you want to draw another actor. Again, that's an empirical question, and it's one that's open for research. Energy and water studies, I think, are consistent with all these types of violence. You can think of intercommunal violence, for example, between pastoralists and sedentary farmers in the Sahel region. These are, in a sense, non-state against non-state actors, at least initially. They're affected very much by these kinds of dynamics. Again, we are forced to specify the effects depending on the type and the category. And I think I've addressed most of those issues. And again, I want to reiterate the fact that I'm forcing people out of their comfort zone because I think we've lost a lot of very interesting questions and very interesting agendas for research by not thinking in that way. Thank you very much.
So you all asked wonderful questions, and your reward is a wonderful lunch, which will be served next. But please, before you go to lunch, join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful speakers. They were excellent. Thank you all.